At first, Tessacol looks like one more contractor on a dangerous deployment. But when the base falls under attack, she treats arterial bleeds, decompresses collapsed lungs, reads terrain faster than seasoned operators, and starts directing the defense like she designed it herself. Then the final reveal lands. The calm voice guiding elite teams for years, the mysterious mentor, has been standing among them all along.
The radio went dead silent. Then her voice cut through a pocket of absolute calm in the war-torn ravine. Rounds poured down from the ridges, tearing the night apart with hot steel. Her command sliced through the chaos, a focal point for 480 men that no DI could ever provide. Alpha, displace west, 150 meters, she ordered. Use the ravine on your port side. Now, wedged behind a slab of granite, Commander Nate Harwick processed it. 30 years in the field had taught him nothing that could fix this kind of tactical collapse. He had 480 of his top-tier men boxed in this canyon. They were deep in hostile territory, a 2-decade conflict zone on a mission Intel had promised would be a cakewalk. That intelligence was a lie. The Eastern attack wasn't an ambush. It was a disciplined execution by a foe that was waiting for them. The Western Ridge answered with its own fusillade. The valley, clear on every sat image, had become a perfect death trap. Red tracers stitched the darkness above. A man screamed from his left, a sound of finality that defied comprehension. From his right, 2 more fell quiet, a silence more absolute than any sound. He keyed his comms. "Doc, send your location. Corpsmen are en route." The pause was heavy. "I'm engaged, sir," she came back. "Watch the northern pass. They're setting a mortar 200 meters east of you. Move your wounded before they range you," he went to argue. Her steady tone steamrolled his rank, broadcasting a battlefield picture he didn't possess. "Move the casualties, sir. I'm securing this spot. Get them clear." Harwick stared at his handset, dumbfounded. In 30 years, he'd never been commanded on his own net. Her voice wasn't without fear, but possessed something forged past it, a resolve born from a certainty he rarely encountered. He relayed the order. He followed it. Vets still say they can't find the words for that night. They'd never experienced a voice like that on the radio. It cut through the din and steadied your soul when everything else was fracturing. She was positioned on the northern incline behind a rock, a new gunshot wound in her shoulder she'd already packed with one hand. Blood darkened her jacket, the cold seeping in from the loss. Yet her concentration was unwavering, her right hand rock steady, and she continued to direct the fight. 477 men lived to see dawn because of her. But this account isn't about the battle. It's about the 18 hours preceding it, when a helicopter crew and a team of operators completely misread the woman who stepped onto their turf. Their assessment of her was wrong on nearly every count. The FOB was situated at 6,000 feet, a tiny dot on a tactical display. It contained a generator, 3 linked shelters, a med tent, a comms hub, and a perimeter they had fortified twice that week. The men who dug in knew that hard work equaled survival, not paranoia. Jagged mountainsides hemmed them in on 3 sides, while the 4th opened into the gorge. The thin atmosphere was a constant, biting chill that no amount of gear could defeat, a hardship they learned to tune out. You adapt to function around the things you cannot change. The cold was one of them. The day's last chopper flew in at 1,700 hours, hugging the ridgeline. The rotor blast scoured the ground as the skids met dirt. The crew chief offloaded 2 fuel bladders and a pallet of medical supplies. A solitary person followed. The bird was already ascending as she cleared the LZ. The prop wash hit her, but she simply held her hair and walked on, undeterred. She knew her path. The camp's blueprint had been memorized 3 days before. She had also mentally filed another piece of data from the intel packet, a key detail she kept close. She had detected an inconsistency, the very thing that made her accept this assignment. She held that knowledge like a concealed dagger. The duffel was standard military issue. Her medical gear was in a Pelican case. She wore gray tactical pants and a fleece, her movements conveying a competence that sought no one's validation. Petty Officer First Class Colt Briggs watched from the landing zone's edge as she passed, a data slate in his hand. He was 6'2", 220 pounds of special warfare muscle, honed over 12 years. He sized her up with the same swift, impersonal analysis he applied to everything. He turned to his buddy and spoke his mind. Her pack weighs more than she does. His teammate started to object, but saw Briggs's expression and clamped his jaw shut. The man had a point. She was 5'4" at best, maybe 118 pounds with rocks in her pockets. Her hair was pulled back efficiently. The guard had double-checked her contractor credentials. Her dark eyes were constantly moving, performing a methodical sweep, not just a casual glance. But Briggs wasn't noticing subtleties like that. His mind was made up as he ran through his pre-mission checklist. Her name was Tessa Cole. She was manifested as a Navy corpsman and civilian asset, assigned by Naval Special Warfare to fill an urgent opening. Her resume was spotless. Johns Hopkins graduate, full trauma certification. Her record showed 2 previous deployments, both non-combat. Her file documented 53 field procedures. All 53 of her patients had survived. That perfect score gave Commander Harwick a moment of pause. A 0-loss record was more than just expertise. It was something else entirely. He located her in the med tent 40 minutes after she arrived. She had already broken down the shipping crates and was arranging equipment by type of injury. She was comparing the op plan against her inventory on a notepad, working with a quiet, focused energy. She glanced up as he entered, her attention shifting immediately. "Commander Harwick, your read-in on the op plan." "I am. Concerns?" Her head canted slightly. "The casualty numbers are based on pre-2021 metrics. Given current intel, I'd raise that projection by 20%. He watched her. "It becomes a logistics challenge," she elaborated. "The terrain makes this aid station a primary target. I need to cache 3 medical kits at rally points. I can get it done tonight." Harwick was quiet. He'd been ready for the standard contractor queries about comms or evacuation plans. He had not expected a contractor to run an independent analysis on his casualty projections. "Do it," he replied. He stepped out of the tent, into the crisp air. He mentally filed the conversation. It felt like a data point that would matter later. Briggs shared his assessment 3 separate times before evening chow. At gear inspection, he complained that her aid bag was equipped for a full-scale invasion. During the mission brief, she sat in the back, her eyes locked on the topo map with an almost palpable intensity. He rendered his final opinion over dinner. He told 3 other operators she was a weak link, stating it as an undeniable fact. It wasn't out of spite. In Briggs's operational world, liability was the single most critical term. A liability was a factor that would get your people killed. It was a risk that had to be identified and mitigated before stepping off. He was simply looking out for his team. He would have told you so with complete conviction, and he wouldn't have been entirely wrong. He had no idea she heard every word from the other side of the tent flap. She simply finished her meal without a word. It was a rule from her father. Tune out the static. Words were a finite resource to be used with purpose. The rest just drains you. She had lived by that code for 16 years. At twilight, Chief Petty Officer Vance Dunar found her by the concertina wire. He was 53, with the solid frame of a man who had done difficult things his whole life. And he possessed a calm the younger men had not yet earned. It was the quiet of a man who had seen hell and carried its burden without faltering. He had said almost nothing since she got there, simply watching her with a look that suggested he was confirming something he already knew. He found her on the eastern line as she surveyed the shadows creeping up the valley. He stood beside her for a full minute, taking in the same view. "Your dad was Frank Cole." She let 2 heartbeats pass before she replied. "Yes," she confirmed. "SEAL Team 3, Desert Storm, Somalia. Retired in 2012. She finally turned to face him. "He was my instructor in Coronado in '95, Dunar said. "I was a punk 24-year-old who thought he was a rock star right before Frank showed me what one actually was." There was a pause. Over the next hour, Frank had methodically deconstructed that self-image. His professional courtesy made the lesson sharper. "He never mentioned you," she said. "He didn't use names." "That's him," Dunar agreed. "But he mentioned you once. I ran into him years before he died. Said his girl had the touch. He described it as the most unique talent he'd seen in 40 years, and he was teaching her to trust it. She offered no reply. He passed in 2019, March 14th, aneurysm, 57. Got through all that just to die in a San Diego hospital, 3 days after a stroke. She relayed the details with no emotion, just facts that had been worn smooth with time. Dunar nodded slowly. "I'm sorry," he said. "Thank you." The valley was a pool of ink. Starlight defined the ridgeline as the camp's generator sputtered on, the lights wavering before steadying. "The way you studied that topo map," Dunar said quietly, "you were looking at the high ground, not the objective." He waited a moment. "That was all Frank." She stayed silent. "Look, I'm not running an interrogation," he said. "I'm just telling you what I saw. I understand what that means. And whatever game you're playing, this camp is going to figure you out." He held her gaze. Somebody had to be in the loop. Now you are. He pivoted toward the base. She lingered at the fence line. And let's be clear about Frank Cole. The man was a ghost. His name isn't on a single after-action report from his 30 years of service. No press, no books. His legend was verbal, passed between operators, history that's never recorded. He enlisted at 18. He passed Bud S on sheer will and a profound calm the instructor saw but couldn't name. He wasn't the strongest or the fastest. He was the one, when it all went wrong, who could wall off the pain and just keep moving forward. Not every operator has that inner fortress. He earned his trident, mastered his craft, then became different. A man who saw the why behind the how. He knew the vast distance between them. Desert Storm in 91, Somalia in 93. That October, he was in a fight that became the definition of a goat rope. 3 deployments to Afghanistan after 9/11. Black Ops missions so deniable they were scrubbed from all official records, untouchable by public inquiry. In the vernacular of his trade, he was a phantom not by desire, but by profession. He retired in 2012 and settled near San Diego. He ran at 0530 every morning, kept his gear immaculate, and taught at a private facility you've never heard of. He put a rifle in his daughter's hands when she was 10. It wasn't to make a carbon copy of himself. He made that plain, and she understood. He did it believing that to understand a weapon, from its mechanics to the gravity of using it, was to learn a fundamental truth about power and its consequences. He instructed her for years, nearly every weekend, and on summer days before the heat became unbearable. Wind calls, breath control, trigger squeeze, the cold calculus of the shot, the patience to find the perfect moment, grasping the line between a shot U times can times make and one U times must asterisk. At 16, she hit steel at 900 meters against a vicious crosswind. He saw the impact, waited a beat, then said, "Correct your follow-through." She did. His absence of praise was the highest compliment, a dialect she became fluent in. Her acceptance to Johns Hopkins had his quiet, steadfast approval. He was certain her hands were made for healing, a conviction he held even as he taught them to destroy. It was a complex and heavy inheritance. In March of 2018, he penned one last letter, a final set of instructions he never mentioned. He sealed it, waiting for the proper time. He knew his heart was failing, and he faced the diagnosis without flinching. But he was a man who planned, and that meant committing final words to paper. He passed on March 14th, 2019, in a hospital. He was 57. She was a 21-year-old sophomore. The news came at 6 a.m. and she sat motionless in her dorm for an hour as her world disintegrated. The floor had dropped out from under her. Her entire reality had to be reassembled on the spot. Then she rose, attended her classes, and focused on the next objective. The way he'd taught her. 2 weeks later, she discovered the letter among his effects at home. She read it in her childhood bedroom in Denton, Texas, the winter sun slanting through the glass. She read it once, then folded it into a pocket, and there it remained. The memories surfaced as she moved to the aid station to assemble her trauma kits. She stashed her main kit at 3 secure spots, each with multiple exit strategies. It was a solo, off-the-books operation after dark, utterly unseen. It didn't matter. The following morning, 4 hours before the push, she found Reed Kowalski. He was 23, buzzing with the raw energy of a new Marine about to see his first real action. A taut spring of a man in peak condition, oblivious to the price about to be demanded. He was doing his pre-combat checks south of the wire, looking solid, just as his file stated, mission capable. She watched him for 90 seconds. She noted the fractional delay in his blinks, a micro strain no one else would catch. But finding the tells was her purpose. It was the only thing she knew. She observed his hands on his rifle. His hold was textbook, but his cadence was off by a fraction. She registered the slight hesitation when another Marine called out to him. A sluggish response. She moved in. Kowalski. He looked over, his expression open and unworried. "Doc, hold fast." He paused. She took his pulse, her fingers resting lightly on his wrist. She examined his pupils. Then she fired 3 quick questions at him, timing his answers. "You have incipient heat exhaustion," she stated flatly. "The signs suggest it started yesterday. Your core temperature is up, your pulse is irregular. I'm starting an IV. You're off full kit for 3 hours?" He started to object, precisely as predicted. "Doc, I'm good. Your reaction time is off by 12%, she stated, cutting him off. "You can't feel it, because from your perspective, everything seems normal. Tonight, that 12% gets someone killed. If you collapse on target, you become a liability." She allowed the statement to sink in. Commander Harwick has to be notified. Kowalski's face changed as he processed her words. "Roger that. Take a knee." She had the IV drip running in 20 seconds. Harwick approached, watching her work without a word. Her report, when she finished, was concise. "He'll be mission ready in 3 hours with fluids. Light duty until 1400. Harwick gave a short nod and continued on his way. Briggs had been observing from about 10 feet away. He shifted his position, and from that moment on, the way he looked at her was fundamentally altered. The mission briefing started at 1300 inside the command post. It was standing room only. Harwick conducted it with absolute efficiency. To him, planning and execution were a single fluid motion. Tessa stood in the rear holding a notepad, her concentration so complete she seemed to vanish. Those who notice everything are rarely noticed themselves. A topographical map showed on the wall. Eastern Valley, 8 kilometers away. A confirmed arms depot inside a building. Approach through the valley, with a secondary route along the northern ridge. 1 sniper assigned, Staff Sergeant Alrek, a reliable marksman. 1 corpsman assigned, herself. She studied the map. As Harwick indicated 2 potential sniper positions, she assessed the terrain. Without looking up, she said, "The rock cluster at grid 477 exposes friendlies to his backblast if he misses. The outcrop at 479, 30 meters to the north, offers better concealment and a superior line of sight." The tent went quiet. Harwick's eyes moved from the map to her. "How do you know that?" he asked. "I'm reading the ground," she replied. He examined the map for another 5 seconds. He then altered the plan, shifting the overwatch to the spot she suggested. Briggs stood 6 feet away. She didn't have to look. She could feel his focus intensify. The quiet shock of a man whose core assumptions had just been fractured. She jotted a note and fell silent. The final hours before an operation carry a unique gravity. The base grew quieter. Actions became more deliberate. The Marines turned inward, preparing their minds for the work ahead. Rifles were broken down and cleaned with a meticulousness learned from loss. Equipment was checked and then rechecked. She performed her own medical pre-checks. Then she sat, her hand resting on the rigid outline of the letter in her breast pocket. It had been there for 5 years, a constant weight against her sternum. Her father understood that critical moments are never scheduled. They arrive unexpectedly and with brutal speed. They give no warning. So you speak what must be said while you can. He had already spoken his piece. She had read his final directive so often it had become the architecture of her own thoughts. The training was no longer a set of memories. It was primal, as solid as bone. She felt it settle in her as the night air grew crisp. Insertion was at 2100 hours, 3 helicopters flying dark and low through the mountain passes. Secured in the second aircraft, Tessa saw the dark peaks slide past. Her mind was a placid surface, a state he had ingrained in her over years. The objective was 3 kilometers away, across a valley that narrowed into a natural kill zone. Intelligence reports suggested a simple mission. Drone surveillance showed nothing. The target was supposed to be easy, but she understood that the space between supposedly and actually could be vast. The information wasn't incorrect, just partial. Ambushes thrive in the gaps. She kept the analysis to herself. Her role was to prepare for the unexpected. 2 clicks out, the helicopters disappeared from the sky. The valley was now aware of their presence. She moved with the corpsman, pacing herself. In the darkness, Vance's gaze met hers, as if guided by radar. He broke contact. She scanned her assigned sector, an automatic, trained response. At 3.5 kilometers, a deep instinct told her something was wrong. A distortion of heat rose from the rocks. It appeared again. It was a pattern, not a random event. She filed it away mentally. Then the evening exploded. An RPG, the shockwave hit them like a hammer. Both ridges erupted with muzzle flashes. It was a perfectly laid trap. The mission was now about survival. The squad dispersed, their actions driven purely by instinct. She was already behind cover, her medkit open. The first wounded man was crawling toward her. Kowalski was going into shock. His femoral artery was severed. She torqued the tourniquet down hard and high, then immediately began packing the wound. She spoke to him, her words sharp and direct, offering tactical instruction, not false hope. He had to remain lucid to survive. Keep your eyes on me. A third body was hauled in, sucking chest wound, lungs collapsing. She drove a 14-gauge needle in. A hiss of air proved it. The ridge guns had them locked down tight. The nests were shielded from this angle. Harwick needed eyes on them. Ulrich's piece was worthless down here. She mapped the guns while patching the last casualty. Her eyes went to the ridge, then to Dunar. He got it instantly. She dropped her aid bag. That HMG was a meat grinder, just a problem of deadly arithmetic. She drew the letter from her pocket, the weight familiar. She'd held it for 5 years. Tonight, it clicked. She secured the letter, met Dunar's gaze. The M24, he knew. She was already moving. The rifle was an extension of her arm. 10,000 reps made it instinct. She ran a quick functions check, not her favorite scope, but it would do. Dunar took a spotter's position. No words were necessary. She began the ascent, a sharp, 35-degree grade. Only the pitch-black night hid her. She moved like a phantom, her silence practiced. The incoming fire was just static. The ground spit dirt nearby. She altered her course. Dunar's steady voice fed her info on comms. From this vantage, their cover was useless. She'd seen the solution in her mind hours ago. She reached her firing point and went prone. The stock met her shoulder like it was molded for her. She acquired them in the scope. 2 hostiles in a sandbag pit. 780 meters, she exhaled. Her father's words from a Texas sunrise age 10. It ain't about power. It's science and discipline. A perfect machine for one perfect moment. 5 years to be decent, he'd said. 20 to be a pro. The gap between a lucky shot and pure will. Wind ENE, 12 knots, confirmed at 780. A 12-knot crosswind meant 14 inches of drift. She dialed the turret, correcting for air, temp, and spin. Inhale 4, hold, exhale for 8. The cadence slowed her heart to the low 60s, the kill zone. Drilled since she was 12. Natural point of aim, shift 2 inches. Muscle trembles, bone is steady. She let the crosshairs settle, hunting the dead space between heartbeats, the quarter-second calm. Her window. She squeezed the trigger. The known recoil pushed back. Reacquired. Missed. 8 inches right. The gunner was already diving for cover. Briggs's smug tone came over the net. Irrelevant. Only the miss mattered. Rerunning the math. Gus. She forgot the damn Gus. Through the glass, the heat mirage showed the pattern. A gust every 8 seconds. 4 clicks left. She reset her rhythm. The breath. The pulse. The pause. She waited for the 2-second lull. She sent it. The heavy gun died. Dunar's flat voice. Splash. Gun's quiet. She was already moving. Second gun, 140 meters south. New problem, new solution. She moved 30 meters downhill, staying low. Rushing in the dark is suicide. Set. Target locked at 920 meters. Reading thermals and valley wind shear. 1 round. Gone. 37 minutes, 6 hides. The guns went down methodically, heavies, then support, then the MGs on the exfil path. She moved through the dark, executing a preformed plan. She fired only on a perfect solution. After the first miss, every round found its mark. Below, the fight shifted. Squads advanced as the enemy fire vanished. She heard Harwick pushing through the gaps she created. Conscious thought was gone now. The time for that was past. The choice was made when she took the rifle. This was just the follow-through. This was her father's lesson. The will to hold when others fold. She never folded. After the last gun fell silent, she scanned for 90 seconds. Content. She keyed the mic. Harwick, ridges are clear, exfil is open, advise main. A pause. Harwick's voice returned, strained with disbelief. Roger, Doc, you're 20? North slope, 80 meters up. Coming down, a longer silence. Easy now, he ordered. She came down. Dunar met her. Harwick's squad just stared. She ignored them. At Alrek's kit, she stowed the rifle, opened her pack, and knelt. Who's wounded? A deep silence fell, the kind that follows a shattered worldview. It wasn't just confusion. The men knew what happened. The facts were clear. Shots fired, enemies dropped. Then she returned, put the gun away, and became a medic again, as if nothing happened. Their quiet was the sound of reality cracking. Briggs watched from the edge for 4 minutes. She was treating Staff Sergeant Dow's calf wound. He observed for 2 more minutes, silent. His face showed a man profoundly recalculating his beliefs. Where the hell did you learn to shoot? He finally asked. She kept her eyes down. My father, who was he? A quick look up, then back to the injury. Navy. Briggs glanced at Dunar, who was coolly observant. Harwick joined them, his authority unshaken, absorbing the new intelligence. He was processing, his eyes locked on her, forming a new profile. Cole, he said. Sir. When you're done. 3 minutes, sir. He waited. She finished the dressing and stood to face him. His perception had changed. Your father, he began. Frank Cole, Master Chief, retired. SEAL Team 3. Desert Storm, Somalia. 3 tours in Afghanistan. Harwick's gaze shot to Dunar. Frank Cole, Dunar confirmed. The name, like an axiom. Briggs was already on his way to the SATCOM. He was pulling Cole's file, and it would be a long night of reading. A new silence fell, not peace, but the heavy quiet of an aftermath, the air thick with memory. She looked at Harwick. 4 more wounded to check before liftoff. Do it, he commanded, watching her move. An hour before dawn, with the wounded stable and perimeter secure, Harwick found her. East flank, back to a rock, restocking her kit with practiced efficiency. He chose a spot to talk, not to interrogate. She expected him. Somalia. Her hand stopped. October 3rd and 4th, 1993. Her father spoke of it twice. Once at 14 when she pushed, again at 20 during a trauma lesson when he revealed a truth about constant combat. She went back to her inventory. Most who were there stay quiet. No, Harwick agreed, they don't. He watched the skyline. He trained you. From age 10, 6 years of methodical practice. Weekends, mornings, summers. Wind, range, trigger. The cold mechanics of the kill. A kit clicked shut. Always my instructor. He had nothing left to teach me at 19. We just maintained proficiency. Then he was gone. I promised my mom, stated simply. She'd seen him leave for war for 30 years. She asked me to let that part of him die with him. Not everything, just the part that took lives instead of saving them. I promised. And tonight was required. She met his eyes. My father taught me a promise isn't the principle. The promise is just the container model. What it's built to protect defines its purpose. When that framework no longer serves its reason, you pick your real side. Harwick watched her. Sounds like a man I wish I'd known. The best man I ever knew, she stated. Less with feeling than with the cold certainty of a law of physics. He paused a moment. Chief Dunar called Frank Cole a ghost, said it was the highest praise he could give. Vance Dunar is not a man who speaks lightly. He said you were the same. She gave no reply. Harwick got to his feet, holding her gaze before his last order. Full debrief after exfil. He specified, not a tactical review of the op. On you, your history, your capabilities, and what was missing from my intel brief. This is for command intel, not a reprimand. I need to know my assets. Understood, sir. He started to leave. Commander, he froze. Kowalski's got a 6-hour window to a surgeon. My patch will hold that long, but that's it. The medevac is already spun up. He gave her one last look. Get some rack time, Cole. She turned back to her gear, beginning the post-op check. Real rest was a ghost she'd stopped chasing long ago. She focused on the process, because the work was the only thing left, and it had to be enough. The letter. She first read it at 21 in a Baltimore dorm. Winter lights striping the floor. The sounds of campus life felt like transmissions from a dead star. She'd found it among his effects 2 weeks after they put him in the ground. It's a lone envelope with her name on it. She sat in her childhood room, hollowed out by loss, and broke the seal. He started with logistics, same as always. Financial papers, his lawyer's contact, pension info, VA forms. He was meticulous, a trait she was grateful for. Clear instructions are a godsend when your world is smoke. Then, the real message began. Tessa, I have to tell you something I should have said face to face, but you don't always get that warning. Time is never that kind, and I've learned you say the important things before the crisis, because there's no room for them in the thick of it. He'd written, you made a promise to your mother, and I honor that. I was the reason she felt she had to ask it of you. I get it. Your mom has a wisdom we don't, the kind you earned loving a man in this line of work for 30 years and figuring out how to bear that weight. But I also have to say this. I'm the one who taught you. I did it because you had to know, not because I wanted you to be me. I was straight with you about that from day one. I taught you because real, deep knowledge is the only way to carry a heavy burden. Someone who's ignorant of a power is its slave. Someone who understands it gets a choice. He wrote, I trust your instincts. I have since you were 12. You have this way of processing the world and getting to the answer that I can't even name. It's damn rare. In 40 years of running with wolves, I've seen it maybe 3 times. He wrote, a day is coming when you'll have to choose between that promise and what you know is right. I won't be there to see it or to guide you. I can only say that I trust you'll know the difference. And whatever path you take, my pride in you was set in stone long before that day ever came. He'd signed it, your father. Not with love, but with fact, which was him to a T. She'd read it 100 times since. The words were branded on her soul, but she kept the paper. It was a physical truth. The feel of it, the press of the ink, the silent fact that his hand moved over this sheet in a room she could still see in her mind's eye. She'd held that letter right before she picked up the rifle on the ridge. Now she sat with her kit in the cold, letting the dawn peel back the night's work with its sharp, clean light. In that first light, she let herself face the promise. She had broken it. There was no other way to frame it. She had stood in her mother's kitchen in Denton, Texas, and given her word, meaning every syllable. Tonight, she had violated that oath. Both facts were true. Both had to live inside her now. Her father saw this coming. He knew a moment would arrive when the promise and the mission would be in conflict, and she would see the correct path. She had 60 operators were watching this sunrise because of it. Kowalski was 23. He'd survive and live a life. The 40 men in the kill box, who would have been vaporized by mortars if the enemy's guns hadn't gone silent, would see another day. She took that fact and filed it. Then she sat still and watched the valley reveal itself in the morning light. Briggs found her an hour later. He walked up without a word, sat on a nearby rock, and stared at the peaks for a minute before speaking. He didn't meet her eyes. "Frank Cole," he said, pulled his file on the SATCOM. She was a statue. Desert Storm. 11 confirmed kills in Kuwait, all by the book. Somalia. 3 tours in the stand. 7 commendations, 4 of them blacked out above my clearance. He paused. His public record is a full career for any top-tier shooter. The classified part must be a whole other level. She remained silent. "I said something when you got here," he finally said. "I see it now, and I'd take it back, but you can't unring that bell." He looked at her then, the professional mask gone. It was the naked look of a man facing a catastrophic failure. One piece of bad intel. I rolled the dice on it. That's not command. It's a screw-up I had no business making again. It was a command call based on available intel, she said flatly. "That's the gig. A gig I blew," he shot back. "Bad process, bad outcome." The words hung there. "So own it," she said. "Put it in the AAR." My old man would have said the same. His eyes snapped to hers. Was he always that blunt? He was a one-and-done instructor. You heard it once, you were expected to execute. She paused. He would have dissected this op all night, flagged every mistake, and in the end, he'd have called the outcome. Serviceable. From him, that was a medal. Briggs absorbed that. When he stood, something in his posture had shifted, solidified. "Just so we're clear," he said, "your work on that ridge was immaculate. The best I've ever witnessed." Then he turned and walked away. The birds were on station at 0900. She triaged 2 wounded on the flight out, her voice a calm, procedural anchor in the chaos. Kowalski was conscious, his eyes locked on hers. Nothing needed to be said. The FOB materialized out of the rotor wash. She moved from the helo straight to the BAS, rattling off every action and decision to the surgical team. A clean handoff was critical. You could win the firefight and still lose the patient on the table. 2 hours crawled by. Harwick was waiting when she emerged. He stood with the heavy stillness of a man who had processed the shock and was now living in the consequences. They sat on a pair of ammo crates. "Talk to me," he said. "How did you get here?" The assigned doc, Marsh. His appendix blew out 4 days ago. His slot went to the contractor list. I put my name in. Why? She'd known it was coming. I saw the op order. It listed 1 sniper. I checked Sergeant Ulrich's jacket. Solid shooter, squared away. But this is too much real estate for 1 gun. The billet was for a corpsman. She met his stare. I can do both, so I took the slot. Harwick just watched her. You got on that helo with a skill set you never declared. I saw a high probability, not a certainty. And you kept it quiet. My medic certs are on file. My trigger time isn't. My father taught me to survive, not to build a service record. Nav Specwar has no paper on me. She didn't flinch. If I had declared, red tape would have grounded me. The approval for a second shooter would take weeks. I had 4 days. The system would have sent a warm body, not an operator who'd already seen the hole in the plan. He was silent. "You knew before you even got here," he said slowly, "and you put yourself in position to fix it without saying a word." "Yes. But why hide it? If I'd shown up as a sniper who also patches wounds, this whole tour would have been a fight over paperwork I don't have. I would have spent my time justifying my presence instead of doing my job." She let the silence stretch. The mission came first. He stood, paced a short line in the dust, and turned back. "The AAR is going to be honest," he said. "Every single detail. This report goes straight to the top. No way to know the fallout. You understand that? I do. It could get ugly for you, sir. 3 Kia, 22 WIA, objective failed. It's a goat rope. My actions go in the report as they happened, or they don't. A lie only protects me, and I'm not the objective." He held her gaze for a long count. "Write it as it happened," she repeated. He gave a single, sharp nod and walked toward the TOC. She stayed, watching the mountains in the hard morning sun. Her fingers brushed her chest. I broke my promise, and it was the right call. He would have understood. Maybe I always knew. I would too. She stood and went back to her duties. The file on Owen Graff hit Harwick's desk at 1300 the next day. He read it, then called his team leads. It was thin. The important ones always are. Graff, born 1973, Knoxville, Tennessee. Enlisted at 18, walked the path that separates the wolves from the sheep, made it through Delta selection. The agency's Special Activities Division picked him up in his 30s. They were the spooks, the deniable assets. By every metric, he was a natural. His file screamed tactical brilliance, but noted he carried the burden, unlike the armchair brass. He shouldered the cost of his missions. Intel flagged this as a plus, right up until it wasn't. 2012, Syria. Operation Cardinal. He led a 4-man cell. The mission was a success, but their exfil was blown. They deployed smoke and hit the panic button. Extraction was inbound. Then, with 40 minutes out, the bird was waved off. Weather was the official excuse. 2 separate satellite feeds showed clear skies. 3 of his men died in the fight that followed. Graff was taken. He endured 18 months of pure hell. His escape was recorded with deliberate vagueness. The military declared him KIA in December of 2012. They were dead wrong. For 12 years, he's been occupied, and the machine he'd been building now held the high ground over them. His strategy wasn't madness, it was methodical. This was the work of a man with a decade to laser focus on one thing, a final accounting for the shadows and the lies. Harwick closed the file. He's not some radical, Harwick stated. He's not trying to burn down the world. He wants payback for a specific betrayal. The words hung in the room. That doesn't justify it, but it makes him more dangerous than any fanatic. A rational enemy is predictable. The gravity of the situation settled on them. He'll be back tonight, Harwick said. No one disagreed. You don't pour 12 years of your life into a cause and quit after one setback. Tessa stood by the wall, silent. She'd already seen the report over his shoulder. He'd let her. One read-through of the file was enough. The information completely upended her understanding of the fight. She pictured a man in Syria, 2012, hearing rescue approach, only to have it replaced by the deafening quiet of being left behind. She thought about what 18 months of that captivity would do to a man's spirit, how it would pulverize his faith in the system, in the flag on his shoulder. She imagined the slow poison of betrayal by his own people and the cold fury it would cultivate over years. She boxed up those feelings and returned to the battalion aid station. The next 4 hours were all about prep. She restocked her med bags, repositioned supply caches, and war-gamed the new attack vectors he was sure to use. She went over every casualty report, knowing first aid was just a down payment on time. Afterward, she systematically ate a hot meal. Her father's words echoed, "Food and sleep are ammo, not comforts." He was rarely mistaken. She managed 90 minutes of solid, combat-ready rest, the kind you steal between firefights. Back at the BAS, she double-checked her setups. Dunar arrived at 1700, his frame blocking the entrance. He said nothing. They shared a look that communicated volumes, the kind forged in chaos when words fail. "This is going to be a real scrap tonight," he finally said. "I know. Your element of surprise is gone. Graff knows your playbook now. He'll be ready for you." She gave a single nod. "Hands good?" She glanced at them, noting a minor blister from the night's work. She mentally dismissed it as a non-issue. "Good to go," she confirmed. He went quiet, the way he did before he dropped a heavy truth. "I got a message from your father," he said. January 2019. 2 months before he passed, she went rigid. "He said he had to tell me about a project of yours. Said he was proud. He never put things in writing. That's how I knew it was serious." Dunar's eyes stared at the canvas, replaying the moment. "He told me you were consulting for a naval special warfare unit. On your own time. Off the books." He paused. "He wrote that you created a new protocol for battlefield casualty care. called it the single greatest advance in Special Forces training in 20 years. His exact words. Her eyes fixed on a supply crate. He said you left your name off it so the lessons would stick without politics getting in the way. He said you made the smart move, that it was all you. Snapping her kit shut, she murmured, "He knew." Silence filled the tent. Beams of light sliced through the canvas, casting patterns on the gear. Outside, the wind howled. Dunar finally spoke. "I had a reason for holding on to this. I knew who you were when you arrived, but not the full story. I'd heard Frank's kid was making a name for herself, but I didn't grasp the scale of it. I didn't know you were the voice." He met her eyes squarely. "Mentioning it earlier might have put you on the back foot. Frank knew you'd deliver without needing the credit. I figured I owed you both the same respect." She measured his words. "He was always 10 steps ahead," she said quietly. "That he was. You knew the second I hit the ground. I had a good idea." The briefing confirmed it. When you laid out your Overwatch strategy, your whole methodology has a unique signature. It was undeniable. He let the words sink in. He gave you the framework, and you built something he never could have imagined. She remained silent. For 3 years, she'd honed that system off-duty, operating outside her corpsman role to fill a lethal gap. It wasn't a sanctioned project with official letterhead and rubber stamps. It was a philosophy engineered from scratch to correct a deadly weakness in how tactical command and battlefield medicine intersected. Her lessons were delivered over a sterile audio channel. No video, no rank, completely anonymous. The operators called their instructor the mentor. She never claimed the title, she just did the work. "It ends tonight," she said. Tonight, he affirmed. He left the tent, granting her a quiet moment as the light faded. She then went to find Harwick. At 2200, Graf made his move. He came from the south, using a network of drainage pipes beneath the valley, a maze the initial survey had labeled impassable. That assessment was almost correct, but not quite. 200 hostiles swarmed from 4 southern exits at once. They moved as a single organism, a unit drilled for this very assault. This was no repeat of the last shambolic attempt. This was a new theory of action from the same brilliant mind. It showed he had learned from his last defeat. The defensive line buckled in 4 minutes. Harwick had predicted the southern approach and stacked his defenses accordingly. The disciplined wall of fire they met shattered their first wave. A second wave crashed, then a third. Relentless, synchronized pressure from 3 directions caved in their defensive perimeter faster than anticipated. It was a perfect counter to a static defense. Tessa was in the aid station when rounds began cracking overhead. In under 60 seconds, she was on the eastern flank, moving low under the tracer fire. Medkit in one hand, rifle slung. The 2 roles were now one. The war inside her had ended in the last 18 hours. A 12-man fire team under Briggs was holding the eastern line. She got to them and instantly triaged the worst wound. Corporal Holloway had a clean through and through in his thigh, with no pressure on it. She got to work, her eyes scanning their position. The heaviest volume of fire was coming from high ground 200 meters to the southeast, giving them a commanding field of fire. Briggs had 2 men on suppression, but their angle was garbage. They were just keeping heads down, not taking out the threat, a critical difference. She stuffed the wound and cranked the tourniquet. "Briggs, that gunner at 210, you got no shot." He shot her a look but didn't waste time arguing. 400 meters, 2 tangos. The one on the left is exposed every few seconds. She was already moving to a better position. "Give me 1 minute." She slid behind a crate and found the target. She dialed in her optic, accounting for the gusting wind. The shooter had a rhythm. Expose for 3 seconds, cover for 4. She watched 3 cycles to confirm the pattern, then took her shot on the 4th. The left target vanished. She low-crawled 40 meters north for a new angle on the second gunner, who had shifted. She found him. Fired. The high ground went quiet. In 30 seconds, she was back, checking Holloway's tourniquet. She cinched the TQ as Briggs processed what had just happened. He simply stared, dumbfounded. She was already on her way to the next casualty. At 2240, Kowalski crashed. He'd been on light duty on a rear line that was now the front line as they fell back. He was pulling his weight until his system just gave out. She'd been keeping a loose eye on his breathing all day, just standard procedure. His oxygen saturation at 1600 was borderline. His respirations were shallow, which she'd chalked up to pain meds, a bad call, an error that had been nagging at her for hours. At 2240, the quality of his breathing changed, and she knew she was on him in 6 seconds. A tension pneumothorax, building for hours, made worse by the evac flight and combat stress. Tracheal deviation, absent breath sounds on the left. A complete respiratory collapse. Kowalski, look at me! No response. His skin was turning the waxy gray of severe oxygen deprivation. She grabbed a 14-gauge needle, found the landmark by feel, second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, and drove it home without a pause. With the needle decompression, hesitation kills. The hiss of escaping air was immediate. His expression eased as his chest rose. With a hand on his sternum, she counted his breaths and saw his color return, her voice steady, catheters placed. Your lungs reinflating? Easy now. Good. He followed her lead. Her hand remained on his chest, feeling his body stabilize, while her brain decoded the symphony of battle around them. She was operating on 2 distinct frequencies, a reality of her existence she had long since accepted. Then, the soundscape shifted. The cadence of incoming rounds shifted. A shooter had a new angle. Her gaze left Kowalski, finding Harwick pinned 70 meters out, completely exposed by a shipping container. Repositioning his team was the right call, but it put him in the crosshairs. Leadership means being a target. His clear path was now a kill box. An enemy at 240 meters had him cold. 3 seconds? Keep pressure, she told the Marine over Kowalski. She moved 8 meters to a crate that gave her the shot. No time for prone. She dropped to one knee, scope up, finding the threat. No controlled breath, no steady pulse. Just center the reticle and squeeze. The target at 240 meters dropped. Harwick glanced from the enemy's spot to her, but she was already back with Kowalski. Her hand returned to his chest, checking the seal. It triggered a memory of her father on a November range day, when she was 20. She'd asked how he balanced the job and his life. He'd been quiet for a long moment. You don't. There is no line. There are just your hands and their tasks. What they do is who you are. The skill is knowing which hand to use. She checked Kowalski's pulse, eyes on the wire. She understood then. She wasn't him, but she was what he'd wanted her to be. Chase the ideal, not the man. Owen Graff called the retreat at 11:14 p.m. No one outside the wire knew the real reason for the failure. The official AAR would blame bad tactics, losing the high ground, failed assaults, and the defenders' discipline. That was the story for the brass. The grunts knew the attack broke because the enemy's nerves snapped against something they couldn't comprehend. They never found a weak point. Every push was met by a deliberate counter, not a scramble. Fatal breaches were sealed instantly. That defense had a mind Graff hadn't planned for. The garrison had an ace he never saw. They melted into the mountains. Harwick had medevac in the air in 4 minutes. The FOB was empty in 17. She was on the 3rd bird, managing 2 casualties. The peaks below vanished into darkness. She focused on the vitals. That was the mission. Graff was captured 3 days later. Harwick attended the transfer, an unspoken professional courtesy. He sized up a 51-year-old man who moved with the sharp efficiency of 12 years in Badlands. Graff was cuffed, his face a mask. He met Harwick's gaze, ready for the reckoning. Harwick let the quiet hang. Syria, 2012. Graff's reply was a sharp, "Yes." "Your team? Read the file. Give me your version." Graff then spoke for 40 minutes in a monotone debrief. When Harwick stood, he offered no empty platitudes. "This should have been on record 12 years ago," he said, turning. "I'm fixing that now." Something in Graff's expression finally broke. It wasn't forgiveness. It was the look of a man whose burden was finally seen by someone who would act. "That'll do," Graff said. Harwick's AAR was 47 pages. He mentioned it to her later. He detailed her complete capabilities, logging 22 field saves and the tactical calls that enabled them. His analysis was blunt, noting her secrecy had produced a superior outcome. He briefed her on it 4 days later. "A rear admiral wants a chat," Harwick said. "Thomas Caldwell. He's run an integrated training program at NavSpec Warcom for 4 years. He greenlit a black box instructional trial 3 years ago," Harwick went on, his tone dry. "Never knew who was behind it." She remained impassive. "He wants to talk potential. It's not an order." Harwick watched her. "He says if he'd known it was you, he'd have pushed it through with a bigger budget." She considered the scale of it. 4,000 operators. A secret protocol becoming doctrine. She weighed the strength of anonymity against the power of an institution. "I'll speak with him," she said. Harwick nodded. "My own kid is 22, he added before leaving. "He's at BUD-S. I see the gap between the medical and tactical training they get." He paused. "What you've built. My son needs that. They all do." He stood. "Glad you were on station." It was Dunar who told them. On the 5th night, the rec hall was packed with a few hundred Marines, others crowding the doorway. She was absent, in the BAS finishing paperwork. Dunar stood and spoke of Frank Cole. Not the man's service record, but his core. What 30 years in the Corps taught him about the work and the legacy he left. He spoke of a daughter who'd earned her inheritance with sweat and dedication. He spoke of a promise kept in a dark valley. Then, in language they all understood, he told them about their anonymous training mentor. The voice from the Sims was the contractor who had just been on their FOB. That steady voice on the net during the second night's chaos, directing squads while she herself was wounded that had been her. A deep silence filled the room as the idea settled. Lance Corporal Reed Kowalski sat bolt upright. He'd heard that voice in 42 separate training sims. He'd never seen a face. The protocol worked because the instructor's identity was irrelevant. It kept him alive. Now, he replayed every lesson in his mind. A memory surfaced, a dark valley, a tourniquet applied under fire, the sharp sting of a needle, a hand on his armor. "Breathe, Marine." He shot to his feet. The Marine next to him followed. It wasn't an order. It was an impulse that spread through men who had faced the same trials. Soon, the whole room was standing. He found her in the aid station, working on her reports. He'd been ambulatory for 2 days, his lungs slowly healing. He sat across from her. Their eyes met. "I know that voice," he said, his own still rough. She didn't confirm it. "Third evolution," he continued. 2 years ago, the Moscow drill. You said triage for outcome, not for speed. The worst casualty isn't always your priority. Aim for the best overall result. I've thought about that 400 times. It changed how I see everything." She put her pen down. "Yes," he nodded. "Why keep it a secret?" She considered the question. With a name and face, the first argument would have been about a civilian contractor teaching combat veterans how to think under fire. She looked him in the eye. "That argument is about me. The material is what works. The lessons had to stand on their own." He processed that. 314 sessions. 14 operators per class, he said softly, doing the math. "That's over 4,000 Marines." He paused. "That includes us." She picked up her pen. "You need rest, Kowalski." "I know." He rose. He held her gaze, his perspective clearly shifted. "At the hatch," he said, "Doc." She glanced up. He gave a single, sharp nod. She returned it. The shoulder operation was a 2-hour repair. She woke from anesthesia fully alert as the drugs cleared. Harwick was in the chair. "Surgery was clean," he said, looking up from a datapad. "You got a clean bill of health." He put the device away. Caldwell called. "He's the admiral who runs that training initiative, the one who approved the anonymous protocol." Harwick met her eyes. "Says he'd have fast-tracked it with more money if he knew. So, what does he want?" she asked, her voice hoarse. "To build out the program, formalize it, give it scale and funding. He's not asking you to enlist. He's proposing something new." She stared at the ceiling, running the new equation. What did 4,000 operators become when their protocol became official doctrine? She thought of Kowalski's simple arithmetic. Was her anonymity more valuable than institutional reach? Was there a correct answer? I'll take the meeting, she said. Harwick nodded. My report is in, he added. The whole story. What you did is now part of the permanent record. Her jaw tightened. Good. Briggs arrived early the next morning, moving with a clear purpose. He sat by her bed. He stared at his knuckles, the silence thick. Back on the LZ, he said, I ran my mouth. Colt, you don't need to. No, just let me. She went quiet. I made a bad call, said it out loud, and I was wrong on every count. His eyes finally met hers. You said I was protecting my guys. I was. But I also let a first impression become fact. That's not being protective. It's a bias I should have shed a long time ago. A beat. I'm sorry. She held his gaze. I accept, she answered. He gave a sharp, thankful nod. Good. Then I want a spot in the first course. Her brow arched. Course? Yeah, Caldwell's new program. The formal training. I want my name at the top of that list. His look was unwavering. I'm 41, with a dozen years on the teams, and I treated tactics and medicine like two different wars. For 12 years, I was wrong. I need to be in that class. She studied him for a long, silent moment. I'll put you on the roster, she said. He rose to his feet. Your father, he started, his voice low, whatever his faults, he built something unbreakable in you, and then he was gone. 6 months on, the dark circles under her eyes were gone. She'd regained the 9 pounds she'd shed during deployment, surgery, and the long road back. It wasn't effort. It was the quiet effect of regular meals, deep sleep, and a system no longer primed for a fight. Her left shoulder still ached when the weather turned, a deep, persistent throb in the rebuilt joint that the surgeon warned might be a permanent souvenir. She filed it away as intel, not an injury, a simple gear status report. She hit the pavement at 0530 every morning, a 6-mile run along the bay, the Pacific to her left. The pre-dawn salt air was a clean, sharp shock to the senses. Her dad used to preach that routine wasn't a cage. It was the framework. That framework is what keeps you standing when everything else tries to knock you down. After her run and a quick bite, she'd hit the training facility for the new integrated combat medicine course. The first cycle was complete. The second was 2 weeks in. The inaugural class had 16 operators. This one had 22. The waitlist for the third was already pushing 47 names. She stood at the door, surveying the 22 men inside. They ranged from 22 to 44 years old, holding centuries of hard-earned operational experience between them. They were here because command finally understood, and because the word was out. The news traveled through the community, from men who'd seen the worst to those heading toward it. The scoop was simple. There's a new course. It teaches you what you don't realize you need until it's all that can save you. Get a slot. Reed Kowalski sat in the back, fully recovered and operational. He had pushed for a seat in the second class the second it was offered. He got it on his own merit. His eyes met hers as she entered, and he gave a small nod of his head. She nodded back. Colt Briggs was in the third row. His focus was absolute, the posture of a man there to learn, not to judge. She moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had demolished a core belief and was building something better on the foundation. At the front of the room, 11 words she had written on the whiteboard the night before hung in the silence, a tribute to her father, that valley, and the enduring question of what truly remains. She hadn't used a printer, just a permanent marker. The words remained between classes, not as a curriculum, but as a fundamental principle, the steel spine of everything they did. Heal when possible, fight when necessary, and know the line between them. Her eyes swept the room. 22 men, drawn from every branch, each with his own history. The one thread connecting them all was this. They had operated where that line meant life or death, and they were here to master it. She phoned her mom on a Tuesday night in November, her BOQ window open to the relentless push of the Pacific, a sound that had become her constant for half a year. Her mother, at 63, was still in the Denton, Texas house where Tessa grew up, where her father, Frank, had meticulously kept a garden. Her mother took over the garden after his passing, calling it the strangest part of her grieving process. Tending his soil was how she kept a part of him alive. Their call lasted 40 minutes. When her mother inquired about the shoulder, she reported it was holding, which was the truth. When asked about the operators, Tessa detailed the second class, their diverse combat experience, their unwavering focus, and the unique pride of seeing a concept take root in men who would carry it to places she'd never see. A brief quiet settled on the phone line. Then her mother's voice returned. I was terrified when I heard what happened over there. Scared, then angry, and then right back to scared. I know. Then I considered what your father would have said. And that was, he would have said, you saw the mission. A pause. He would have said you were exactly where you were supposed to be. He'd say, I taught her to see the line. He told me that, Tessa said, her voice quiet. I know, honey. He told me he did. Her mother's voice sounded like a heavy burden being carefully set down. He was always playing a different game than everyone else. Yeah. Are you okay with it all? Tessa looked out her window at the dark pulsing ocean. I think I am, she replied. I think I always was. I just never named it. Good, her mother said. That's what matters. Later that evening, she pulled the letter from her jacket's inner pocket, where it had been for 5 years and 3 months. She sat at her desk, holding the sealed envelope. Its contents were already part of her, absorbed years before, less an external command and more a part of her own internal structure. She just held it. She recalled his talk about the oath versus the principle, about the hard calls a real operator has to make, about trusting your gut when it all goes sideways. She had trusted her gut. It had been the right decision. She opened her desk drawer, set the letter inside, and shut it. Not discarded, not forgotten, just put to rest. She no longer needed to carry it. The message was already forged into her very being. She'd been reading it for 5 years. Its purpose was served, the lesson learned. She was the lesson now. Monday morning, 0800. She faced them, the Coronado light flooding the room, 22 operators watching her. Behind her, those 11 words were a stark creed. Words she'd written, words she knew to be true in her bones. An update from Caldwell's office the previous night confirmed it. Applications for the 3rd class had doubled expectations. 2 other commands were looking to stand up their own version of the course. The Senate's classified brief on Syria was now official. What happened in the dark was now in the record. She let that settle for a moment, then compartmentalized the thoughts. She met Kowalski's gaze in the back, notebook ready, watching with the intensity of a man who knew the cost of this knowledge. Her gaze shifted to Briggs in the 3rd row, his posture rigid. A man who had proven in 2 weeks that a true commitment to learn can change a person. She pictured her father on his 6-mile run at 0530 in San Diego. She pictured a man who knew that the most vital work leaves no paper trail, no medals, no official record. He understood that what lasts is the capability you build in others, the code that survives long after you're gone. It's not the actions you take, but the wisdom you leave behind. She remembered a darkened valley, a letter in her grip, and a choice made in the 2 seconds it took to break a promise she had to break. She thought of 63 killed in action and 477 souls who saw another sunrise because of the brutal math she was forced to do. She recalled her mother's voice, the letter finally put away after 5 years. She considered what it takes to walk through hell and come out whole. She looked at the 22 men who would face their own trials again, who were here to learn how to carry a different kind of burden on the trip home. She took a grounding breath. All right, she said, let's get to work. And the training began.